Okay, my name's Dudley Storey, and I'm here to, as a last-minute kind of request, to back on the excellent presentation by Sarah Sweden on SVG. To make a long story short, Sarah was originally going to talk about shapes, and I was originally going to talk about SVG, and she got in, and I didn't quite get in, but then she changed her mind. So I'm going to try and do a accessory topic to that, featuring a little bit of my own work and talking about some of the things that Sarah didn't have time to address. But I would recommend that if you're watching this now, you go see Sarah's first so you can get the basics from her. But I'm going to start off from just a little bit of perspective. So I am Dudley Storey, at Dudley Storey on Twitter. I have a blog called demosthenes.info, where I write about web development. And by trade, I'm a web development teacher. That's what I do. I teach full-time, part-time, night classes, all the time. That's what I do. I'm also a writer. I published through Apress last year, Pro Css3 Animation. And I'm also a contributing editor to Smashing Magazine. I do their coding section. So most of the requests for and offers of writers come for coding, at least, come through me for Smashing Magazine. So, SVG. SVG's been thought of and debated and worked through as a kind of, very often as this foreign thing, this foreign, not terribly understandable kind of battle against CSS. And it's really not right. We really shouldn't think of SVG and CSS as being enemies or even being frenemies. They really are two parts of the same side. So don't think of them as battling each other. Just think of them as one tool that's like a kick-ass lightsaber. That's essentially the joined together. And I'll show you ways in which both CSS and SVG and ultimately HTML can really start to complement each other. They're not, oh, it's only just SVG or it's only just CSS. The two really do start to work together in very interesting kinds of ways. So I'm going to give a very quick little breakdown of a couple of things that people need to do. Again, Sarah covered a little bit of this, but I'm going to do an addition. Some of this is, again, from my blog, but I'll give you URLs. So Adobe Illustrator workflow for SVG production. So very quickly, if you know, and most people will be using Adobe Illustrator to get some sort of work out. If you know that you're going to be using Adobe Illustrator for export to SVG, then there's a couple of things that you do want to do. You'll want to set up your canvas in pixels, and that seems kind of weird at the first because SVG is meant to be the scale-free, doesn't matter what kind of units you use, and that's true. But it's easiest if you set up a canvas first in pixels because it's the easiest thing to relate to. It doesn't mean that your SVG is limited to a certain pixel dimension. Don't get that in your head at all. But it does help move things across, work out where components are, that sort of stuff. The artboard that you make, so whatever size of artboard you want to make is perfectly fine. But the artboard is going to become the viewbox of the SVG. Essentially, although viewbox does a lot of things in SVG, essentially that's the visible area of your SVG. So if you want to do things off canvas, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure that your artboard is a certain size. But if you want to make it larger later, that's perfectly fine as well. Just be aware that the two will, by default, match up in Illustrator. Again, you can change them. SVG, again, in Illustrator will set itself up for CMYK. Don't make the mistake that generations of people have made when using these tools and set it up for CMYK when you really want RGB in most cases. So make sure it's RGB. The thing to remember about making components in Illustrator is that as you make them, the way that I like to think about SVG is you're making drawings as data. You're not just making pretty lines. You're not just making curves. You're making drawings as data. So as you build things, give them some sort of naming convention. Get any kind of naming convention is fine as long as you're consistent and you stick to it. So stick to building something and name everything as you build it. While it's not absolutely necessary to do so, it becomes a whole lot easier later when you're trying to then manipulate that as a pure SVG. Simplify, a couple of things. As a rule, use the fewest number of points to create a shape. Again, a lot of people will start to use point to try and get something on screen. Don't do that. Try and use the fewest numbers of points. Try to avoid filters in Adobe Illustrator as they're not yet translated into SVG with the Adobe Illustrator SVG export. So don't tend to do that. Don't stroke things if you don't have to. Stroking is going to add another level or layer to your SVG that you really don't need. If you need it, fine, but if you don't, make sure it's not there. And try to keep polygons and circles as geometrical objects. Don't try to break them apart. Create a background if necessary. Understand that SVG elements are transparent by default. They're automatically off-masked. That's awesome. But it means that there's no body to an SVG element. There's nothing there that you can say, oh, okay, I'm just going to color the background of this black or whatever it happens to be. You can do that in the body element of your HTML page where the SVG is ultimately going to be used, but you can't do an SVG itself, short of drawing a giant rectangle or something behind the whole artboard. You can kind of, sort of, do a background on the SVG itself using, as we'll take a look at in this a little bit, you can use CSS to create backgrounds. So it's possible to do. You've just got to be a little bit careful about how you do it. Finally, if possible, before exporting from Illustrator to SVG, try and merge shapes. So use Pathfinder tools, try and merge them together if possible. Again, fewer elements, simple elements, better. Doesn't mean that the SVG can't be complex, doesn't mean it can't involve a lot of elements, but obviously the fewer things you have, the better. Finally, decide how you're going to treat your text. It's important to understand that you can, in SVG, have text as text, so it's readable, it's stylable, it's everything else. But with the downsides that we've experienced with text, readable, stylable text on the web forever. That is, you might try and load a font and the font doesn't load, right? If you're trying to use a special kind of font. So it has all the same problems in that regard. Or you can break it apart. You can absolutely break it into outlines. Downside of that is it's not readable anymore. It's purely path information. You just can't use it that way anymore. So do try to make a decision about, is this going to be readable? Because it is, by Google, by everything else. Then leave it as text, style it, and understand that, okay, styles might not always be applied in every circumstance. We've got to be careful with that. Or you want it exactly that way, but you don't want it ultimately readable by anything, but you want it manipulable, so you can move points around. Then absolutely break it and convert it into outlines. Finally, crop the artboard. No point in having areas that you don't need, and export to SVG. One thing to keep in mind about that, the export for SVG, Adobe Illustrator kind of, even Adobe Illustrator CC kind of sort of lies to you. It does allow an export, it absolutely does, but Adobe Illustrator CC has this semi-vaunted new feature of make responsive. And it's not totally true. It goes part of the way. It removes the height and width elements, which I'll get into in a little bit, but it doesn't really do everything that you need it to do in most circumstances. So take the make responsive in option in SVG with from Illustrator with a grain of salt. There's one important point in Illustrator to try to, you've got an option to reduce the number of decimal points used in as the export. And honestly, decimal points are the position of each little element, the position of each little point in the SVG drawing. You don't need 3 decimal places for drawings in the vast majority of circumstances. So if you can avoid that, because all it does is add file space, it just makes the SVG larger and longer. If you possibly can, reduce the number of decimal points to ideally 1. All this stuff can ultimately be done post-processing with some of the tools that Sarah talked about. But why post-process something when you can make sure it's right the first time? So, and finally, obviously, export the file as an SVG, treat it as SVG. It's all good to go from that point. Okay. Basic SVG cleanup. So again, Sarah was talking a little bit about how to make a SVG clean through the nature of some tools. And that's good to know, and that's important. It's also really useful to know what those tools are actually doing. It's not terribly complicated for the most part, and if you understand a little bit about what they're doing, then you can do this by hand. If the tool doesn't work, you can understand what might go wrong, things of that nature. So there's a couple of things. Generally speaking, the export of an SVG document will be from Illustrator, from Inkscape, from a number of other tools, will be extremely verbose. You'll have a lot of information in there. And while it's not wrong to have the information in there, you can usually save yourself quite a bit of space by doing a couple of things. So, first of all, note again that this, in this case, has 5 decimal places for the SVG points on the path. And again, wouldn't be necessary. I could post-process this, take them out. But I'm not going to concentrate on that for right now. Okay, things you don't need. You honestly don't need in the vast majority of cases, unless you're doing some sort of deep dive with XML. You don't need the XML prologue. You don't need the doc type. You just don't need them. You do need the XML NS namespacing stuff, mostly for the fact that without it, it's not going to be valid. So you may as well leave it in. Version you don't technically need. Width and height. Width and height are the things that, for the most part, get people a little bit screwed up because they think that what's constraining this thing is the width and height or the view box. Take the view box out and they get confused between the two. So I'll explain what's going on there. For right now, take it out. Notice that nothing actually changed. You don't need ID on the SVG element itself unless you're doing a whole bunch of work. Whole bunch of SVGs on the same page. So again, we can take that out. Everything's fine. Don't need ID. At the same time, of course, make sure that it's still valid. Make sure that everything is still working. Don't need defs very often unless it's defining a filter or some other stuff. Do be careful about group transforms. You'll very often find empty groups, so groups that don't actually do anything. Group, just G's. If they don't do anything, they can usually be removed. If they're groups with IDs, if they're groups with transforms on them, leave them the heck alone. You don't want to play around with them because otherwise removing them or changing them will otherwise spoil your work. Then there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Here's where it gets interesting. Okay, so I started off talking about the fact that SVG and CSS are really copacetic. They're really buddies. They're not fighting against each other. So let me demonstrate a couple of ways in which that's true. You can see that by default, most tools will put a lot of the styles for this stuff inline. Doesn't need to be inline at all. Does need to have a path, sorry, an ID, but doesn't need to be inline at all. You can do the same stuff that you've always been used to and work with by doing an embedded style tag. inside the CSS. And that style tag can absolutely contain the vast majority of the CSS that you're used to. It can contain media queries. It can contain hovers. It can contain most of the stuff that you're used to. Again, Sarah did a very nice little screen of here's what the page will take, here's what it won't take. So there are some exceptions, but for the most part, every piece of CSS that you're used to can actually be applied. Here's where it gets interesting. So our path has an ID of path1. Let's just change that. Let's just call that Jedi. Okay. So it has an ID. If it has an ID, it can be addressed like an ID, or a class, or most anything else that you're used to. It can be addressed as an ID, just like anything else, right? It's a fragment, so it's a piece on a page. It's part of the DOM. The really interesting part is this stuff can get used as part of that style. We don't need even on, we don't need stroke in this case. All right? Okay. So what's happening? Essentially, we can take many, not all, but many of the style attributes from SVG and apply them as styles in CSS. That starts to make things really neat and really interesting. What it means is that you can use any CSS, color in this case, associated with that style, right? So it means that you can have immediate manipulation of this. Now, people get a little confused, often, students I teach, get a little confused the first time I show them this, because they say, but there's no fill property. Does that mean I can now go onto my normal HTML page and say div fill red? No, you can't. It's only applicable to SVG. But within the context of SVG, it's perfectly understood and perfectly reasonable. So the really interesting part is that all of the CSS, all the CSS that you know can absolutely be applied. So if we say, let's say, HSLA, for goodness sake, and we say, okay, 100, 50%, 50%, comma, 0.3. Okay, so yeah, any HSL, any colors, any kinds of things that you want to apply, you can absolutely do. It doesn't mean that you have to stick with hex. If you want to stick with hex, that's perfectly fine. This opacity. Okay, so SVG has a thing called opacity for obvious reasons, or fill opacity. But you can do opacity in however you want to set it up, in just the way that you would in CSS, right? It's a CSS thing. So now we can use CSS directly on our SVG. Okay. You can do hover effects inside your SVG just using CSS. So if you say, let's say, hover over that element. Okay, it's got an ID, hover over it. Let's say we want to do a partial fade. Okay. Now, there's a couple of interesting things to note about that. And of course, yeah, you can transition as well, right? Let me push that down all the way down to 0. So yeah, it fades in, it fades out. So you can absolutely do all the interface stuff that you're used to in CSS3 applied to SVG. There's a couple of interesting things to note about this. SVG is defined by shapes. If SVG is defined by shapes, it's not the box model you're used to, in the sense that you'll notice that if this was a picture, like a ping under normal circumstances, as soon as you move over the area of the thing, right, the rectangular box that contains it, then this thing's going to activate, right? But in SVG, that doesn't count. It really only looks at the shape. So I have to be over that shape before anything happens. And that starts to mean very, very precise pixel responses. We've all seen icons, big rectangular icons with circular shapes inside, and the problem is you move over the rectangular outside area and the circle turns on or clicks or does whatever it's going to do, and it's a misregistration. In SVG, one of its real advantages is there is no misregistration. If you make a shape and you say this shape is a link, or this shape has a hover effect, or this shape has whatever, that's the shape, and that's what registers, which makes it really, really powerful and very, very good. Okay, so that's your basic SVG cleanup. That's and some of the ways in which you can start to use CSS practically. I'm just saying, okay, I've got this SVG, I want to make it hover. The one thing I should mention, the one thing you have to be aware of is that CSS written inside the SVG, it will affect the appearance of the SVG, but not its interactivity. In other words, you can't write a hover rule inside an SVG and then take that SVG as an image and put it on the page as image, here's my SVG, as inside your HTML page. The appearance will work, but the interactivity won't. If you want the interactivity, you've got to move it either as an object or as a, typically, increasingly, just as a flat SVG straight inside the HTML. You just bonk it inside the HTML. And then you get all the interactivity, you get everything else. So you've got to be a little bit careful about, okay, I can write rules, absolutely, but those rules won't necessarily translate interactive-wise into the SVG as an actual image. But SVG straight on the page, absolutely will work. Okay, so a surprising number of people in the conference that we've just been attending don't know about SVG filters or using filters in general. There was a quick little hand up and very few people were using them. And that's surprising to me because one of the things that we're talking about increasingly is, okay, we want to get pages loaded as quickly as possible. We want to have interactivity as snappy as possible. We want to not have a lot of work to make things happen. We don't want to have to do multiple things in our workflow. So, traditionally with filters, people think of filters with WebKit, and understandably so, because filters in WebKit, they've been in there for a couple of years now, and people say, hey, they're really neat. And it's totally true. You can absolutely, while they went through a couple of changes in terms of the spec, yeah, you can absolutely do filters in that way. But not too many people know that the same filters were also built into IE up into IE 8, right? I'll talk a little bit about IE 10 and 11 and so on and so forth in a second. And very often they were really simple, stuff like that. Sorry, stuff like this. So, all right, so you have Safari, and at least modern Safari, and modern Chrome covered with the modern WebKit CSS3 thing that unfortunately other browsers haven't integrated yet. You have IE up to 9 covered by the grayscale filter. What do you do about Firefox? Well, in Firefox, you can add a tiny, tiny little SVG file. And that SVG file is, sort this out a little bit. Excuse me. That SVG file is like the world's simplest SVG. It's tiny. In this case, to be fair, it's a color matrix. The nice thing about this is you really don't need to understand it totally. It's matrix math. It's no big deal. But you pop it into a page. Or you can pop it in as a separate file if you want to, but it's so tiny, I usually pop it straight into the page. Okay. What does it do? Very simply, it's a bit of SVG that essentially does the same filter job. So, that filter grayscale, filter URL grayscale, because it looks at the ID, right? In this case, the filter has an ID of grayscale. So I use it here. And it does the exact same job in Firefox. And the nice part about this is that you now have the same effect. And it's one of the really good examples of progressive enhancement. Unless you or your client are a real stickler for everything has to look exactly the same way, generally speaking, people aren't going to be hugely upset if they're in IE10, for instance, and if they don't know that the thing is meant to be black and white and then transitioning into color later, and they just see a color version because IE10 is in between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't yet support the WebKit CSS3 style filters. It doesn't do the SVG filters, at least in this way. So unfortunately, it's in a rocky place at the moment. But if they're not aware of that, then that's fine. The advantage is you load one image once. You want to turn it into SVG, you want to turn it into grayscale, that's perfectly fine. You add a filter and it's done. You don't have to load multiple versions of the image. You don't have to have multiple HTTP requests. You don't have to do weird things with image sprites. They're just done. So it's nice. It makes a whole lot of sense to me. You could do the same things, same idea, with things like blur. Again, traditional Microsoft blur filters, okay, so IE8, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Modern blur filters in terms of WebKit, and blur in terms of SVG. And you can transition the things as well. So yeah, you can absolutely have blur on and off. Sepia toning, totally possible as well. Let me think for a moment here, very quickly, because I'm almost out of time. Couple of other areas in which people don't necessarily understand that SVG can start to be used. Image maps. For anybody who's been around on the web for 10 years plus, will remember image maps. And they went kind of the way of the dodo. They're not responsive. They were kind of these big, large images. But they still do have their place. They were actually really good for touchscreens, because, especially for kids, because they could see them and they could touch them, touch the pictures, and navigate away from there. Problem was they're not responsive at all. Traditional image maps can't be. SVG, you can absolutely make responsive image maps, because you can make SVG responsive. You can put an image, bitmap image in the background, and that hotspot will exactly scale with the image as it moves up and down, which is really neat. Animated image maps. Using clip areas, you can clip out bitmap photographs using paths in SVG. You can then, again, because it's perfect pixel perfect registration, you can start to both link those areas and animate them inside. Had an article in Net Magazine a couple of months ago about that same technique, if you want to read up on it. Perhaps most fun, adaptive illustration. So adaptive illustrations are the idea that you can do media queries inside of SVG. So a lot of traditional kinds of use of SVG and responsive design is making things smaller. Again, nothing wrong with making things smaller, rearranging them, placing them in different orders. That's perfectly fine. What's somewhat unexplored, I think, is the concept of, well, we don't just need to make things smaller. We could also do things like, as an example, starting to remove components. And you can remove components. You can see the top there. You can see other components moving outside of this, because each fragment is identifiable inside that SVG. So you can absolutely remove them using media queries and simplify designs. Not just say, okay, this thing has to get smaller, and not just saying, oh, we have to switch to something else, but literally simplifying diagrams on smaller screens, simplifying tree diagrams, for instance, on smaller screens, because you don't have the space and no one's going to zoom in and out. There's all kinds of really wonderful possibilities there. Very finally, the CSS Spec for gradients is meant to have animation. It's meant to do it. Unfortunately, it doesn't. No one, to my knowledge, no one supports it yet, which is really, really unfortunate. However, SVG has supported animated gradients for ages, forever. So you can start to do really, really interesting work. Oh, this comes up. By animating the actual gradients. You have to use animate tags inside of SVG, and they're not too dissimilar to the concept of transitions. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not too terribly dissimilar. So you can finally, this is a basic sky, 24-hour sky animation. You can finally start to animate gradients, which is wonderful. And there's a lot in there. And eventually, of course, this will be supported in CSS. But if you need it right now, you want an animated gradient, do it in SVG, absolutely. So that's all the time I have. I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have follow-up questions, by all means ask me on Twitter, follow up on the blog, and I hope to do a fuller and more complete A-Track presentation in future CSS Confs. Thanks very much.